the usual scientific assumption is that all the laws of nature and all the constants of nature were fixed and emerged from nothing at the moment of the Big Bang, along with all the energy and matter in the universe. And as my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws of nature from nowhere in a single instant.
I see what you did there.
One free miracle.
Wow.
I love it.
Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. This is Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Doug McBurney, Bible student, science geek, amateur comedian. Fred, it is great to be back with you talking about real science on Friday.
Today we have a very special guest joining us, an absolutely brilliant scientist, and it's none other than the renowned Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. He's coming to us from the United Kingdom. So welcome to Real Science Radio, Dr. Sheldrake.
Good to be with you.
Yes, Dr. Sheldrake, I have been looking forward to this interview literally for years, ever since I watched your video experiment with dogs and their owners. And it wasn't just watching the video, it was then doing a little bit of research and discovering the controversy around the intensive efforts to disprove anything you said. And you have quite a biography, and for time I'll have to summarize for our audience. Dr. Sheldrake earned his PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge University. He is an author or co-author of 15 books and more than 100 research papers. In fact, on ResearchGate, Dr. Sheldrake's research interest score, which combines the number of reads, recommendations, and citations, is in the top 4% of all scientists. Dr. Sheldrake is best known for his theory of morphic resonance and his ability to cause acute discomfort among those he's dubbed, quote, a scientific priesthood with an authoritarian mentality. And for time, I've left a great deal out, Dr. Sheldrake. Is there anything else in particular that you would like to add?
I think that's enough to start with, Doug.
So, well, Dr. Sheldrake, a couple years ago on one of our shows on the universal constants, we played a clip from one of a TED Talk that you had that apparently got banned. And I think it was on your book, The Science Delusion. And you questioned some dogmas in science, such as the universal constants. And at the time, we were particularly interested in your view on the speed of light and how it had, and I emphasize past tense had, changed in the past. Can you elaborate a little bit on that for our audience? Because there's a topic related to like plasma cosmology that you may be familiar with that our audience tends to, we tend to have a view that, you know, the speed of light did change in the past.
Well, I didn't come to this with any particular presuppositions, but I got interested in the so-called constants of nature because I thought this is a kind of dogmatic assumption that they're constant. Are they really? So, you know, I believe in empirical evidence. So I took a look at the historical record. I had to go to the Patent Office Library in London because most libraries throw away the handbooks of physical constants when a new edition comes along, but fortunately they kept them. So I managed to get them to get, you know, from the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. They brought them out from their reserve stock room, dusting them off. And I found that if you looked at the actual records, almost all the constants vary quite a lot, including the speed of light, which dropped by 20 kilometers per second between 1928 and 1945 all over the world. And the figures they were showing have tiny error bars. You know, it's not as if they had errors of 30 kilometers per second. They had errors of, you know, 0.001 kilometer per second. And so there's a huge change. Well, I went and talked to the head of metrology, the science that measures these things, at the National Physical Laboratory in London. I asked him about it, and he said he was a little bit embarrassed by it, and he actually said, "You've discovered perhaps the most embarrassing incident in the history of our science." So I said, "Well, how do you explain the fact that all around the world people were getting it 20 kilometers per second lower than before?" And I said, "Well, they're just fudging the results to get what they expected." He said, "We don't like to use the word fudge." I said, "Well, what do you prefer?" He said, "We prefer the more delicate phrase, intellectual phase locking." Uh, so anyway, I said, it changed in the past. So how do we know it's not going to change in the future? And he then said it can't. And I said, "Why not?" He said, "We fixed it by definition." And he said, "We've then defined the units of time and space, the meter and the second, in terms of light itself. So if the speed of light does change, no one will ever notice."
Nobody will ever notice that.
So they tied the speed of light to the meter itself, and so you can never ever detect another change in the speed of light. That's
right.
amazing.
They fixed that one, but they haven't fixed the gravitational constant, which still varies quite a lot. And as I was leaving, he was very friendly. As I was leaving, he reached down to below his desk. There was a cardboard box down by his desk. He said, "You might be interested in this." He said, "These pamphlets have just come from the printers." He handed one to me and said, "The latest values of the physical constants."
That's amazing.
Now, did he say that without a trace of irony?
Yes.
So intellectual phase locking, is that because like all these different people from different part around the globe were coming up with the same numbers, and in order to fudge them, they had to all interlock? Is that that's referring to?
I think he's just referring to the fact they got the expected answer. And how
Gotcha.
they do that is they correct their answers, they discard outlying values, that kind of thing. And when they get the expected answer, they just sort of stop the correction process. So that's basically what was going on, apparently.
Gotcha. So are you aware of Barry Setterfield's idea that the speed of light was faster in the past? I'm not sure if you've ever...
No, I have not actually, no.
Yeah, because I know I've listening to some of your stuff. I know you're so... Your intellect is incredible, and you know so much about physics and like 0-point energy. And so he believes the 0-point energy increased in the past so that the speed of light is like swimming through molasses. So that's why, because it's, we're creationists here, and we believe, that the universe isn't that old. It's, maybe 7,000 years old. But we have a real difficult time explaining distant starlight. And so he had come up with this idea that the speed of light was faster in the past, and because the 0-point energy increased, the light was traveling slower as that energy increased. And what was super interesting, and I wish I could get any physicist to work on this, is he's provided scientific data that the quantized redshifts that we see as we look out match the electron jumps, the quantized differences in electrons in the atom. And I haven't had anyone really look into that to confirm if it's true. I just wanted to kind of run that by you and see what your thoughts are on that. And I wasn't sure, again, if you'd even heard of any of this before.
Well, I'm sorry to say I haven't, so I can't really comment on it.
Well, how do you explain the redshift, or have you thought about the redshift?
Well, I have thought about the redshift, yes. There's one, the theory, there's the standard theory, of course, that it's the recession, it's the Doppler effect. But I'm interested in the unconventional cosmologist Halton Arp. I don't know, is he on the radar?
Oh yeah, they're definitely familiar with his work. Yes.
Yes. Well, as you know, he thinks that in quasars, they're creating new matter. He thinks that matter is being created all the time. It wasn't just in the Big Bang. And he thinks newly minted matter is being spat out of quasars. and newly minted matter has an intrinsic redshift because it takes time for the rest of the universe to register that it's there, and that sort of affects the redshift. So anyway, that's another theory of redshift, Holton Arp's newly minted matter theory. I'm sure there are others. Anyway, I quite like Arp and his ideas, so I've paid more attention to that than the others.
Gotcha. So do you have an issue with like dark matter as a explanatory device for, why galaxies, stars seem to be moving a lot faster than the amount of matter can allow?
Well, I mean, dark matter I see as just a fudge factor invented by physicists to explain their equations. And I mean, basically, the stars and the galaxies don't behave as they're supposed to, according to standard gravitational theory. So they're able to make them fit by adding in arbitrary amounts of dark matter, which is invisible and unobserved, just to make the equations balance. And, it's like if you were dealing with a spreadsheet of an accounts and there are huge gaps in the account, it's like adding virtual money to fill in the holes. Or actually, banks do it all the time with quantitative easing. They just sort of create extra money. Well, this is dark matter, I see, as a kind of quantitative easing of matter within the universe to fit the facts.
Yeah. Well, very, very well said. I've often observed that many of our atheist friends, they accuse us, Christians, creationists, of anytime we don't know the answer, we just add God, and who they call magic. But, we would say that there's an awful lot more evidence for the Creator, God, than there is for dark matter. I mean, you have the Jewish race persisting for 4,000 years through history, and the Christian religion persisting for 2,000 years in the face of not academic banishment, but actual execution, even crucifixion. And so there's an awful lot more evidence for what they call our fudge factor than what we recognize as their fudge factor. And I'm very encouraged that you recognize that as a fudge factor. That's encouraging to me.
Well, and I wanted to ask you, Dr. Sheldrake, so, you've got your hypothesis on morphic resonance, but maybe for our audience, perhaps a backdrop that they may be interested in is, I know you view yourself as a Trinitarian, from a science point of view. And maybe if they had a better understanding of what you're referring to, I'd like to kind of jump into that a little bit before we talk about morphic resonance, which I think ties into this view.
You mean my view on the Holy Trinity?
Well, no, not necessarily, but just your position as a Trinitarian, that there's three different ways of explaining things. And if you do have a view on the Holy Trinity, that would be awesome too. But I'm thinking more along the lines of, is everything just matter and energy, or is there a third element? Is there information? Is the mind and the consciousness separately? I know conscience is something that science has tried to deny for many decades, if not centuries. And I don't know, I guess I wanted to maybe start with you elaborating on where you come from on this particular topic of, matter, energy, and information.
Well, I prefer the word form to information, because information is information. It's that which puts form into things. And I think it's easier to think in terms of form, just form itself, like the shape of flowers or the shape of an animal or a building or a chair. Or we're used to forms, and information's a theory about how the form gets there. So I'd rather stick to form. But you see, I think that the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, which I find a very helpful view, is that the ground of all being is consciousness. And the first revelation of God to Moses in the Old Testament, when Moses says, "Who are you?" he says, "I am who I am." Well, that's a definition of conscious being in the present, of conscious being, I am. It couldn't be simpler and clearer. But the doctrine of the Holy Trinity says that then in the Logos, the second person of the Holy Trinity, in the beginning was the Word. The word Logos, given its background in Greek philosophy and the fact that the New Testament is written in Greek, basically means forms, ideas. Hindus call it nama rupa, names and forms. It's the principle of form or order in the universe. And then the Holy Spirit is the principle of movement or change. All the images of the Spirit are of movement and change. Wind blowing over the water, breath, flames of fire, flying birds, and so on. And so basically, I think what it's saying is there's a ground of consciousness behind everything, and this is manifested through the Logos, which comes before Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, it says in the Creed, through him all things were made. Well, all things weren't made through Jesus of Nazareth in AD 0. They were the whole universe we differ, no doubt, of how long we think it existed before Jesus, but it certainly existed before him in almost everyone's view. I think that basically the principle of form, the Logos is the principle of form and order. And if we look in physics at what its view of matter and energy is, basically physics says that matter itself is made of energy bound within fields. Fields are what in nature represents form, order, structure, and is what gives shape and structure to the universe. The gravitational field gives the spherical shape to the sun and the moon and the earth and the stars. The electromagnetic fields help and the quantum fields shape all matter and all things. So I think that there's a principle of form, and there's a principle of energy that moves through them. And what physics calls energy, I think, is the physical manifestation of the Holy Spirit. So I see the whole universe as a manifestation of the divine, not just in an initial act of creation, but in the ongoing sustaining of the whole of nature as it is.
Okay. Yeah, we've got a really good website, a web page on the number 3. So it's called RSR, brought to you by the number 3. It's at rsr.org/3. And it's really interesting, because, in the Bible, there's all kinds of references to number 3. We could go through all kinds, like, the Hebrew scriptures are composed of 3 sections, the law, prophets, and writings. God created 3 archangels and, of course, the Trinity. And then you look at nature and you've got the number 3 all over the place. I mean, you've got, the universe exists in space, matter, and time. Space itself exists in 3 dimensions, height, width, and length, as does time in past, present, future. And even matter appears to be a wave, a particle, and information. And it's interesting you bring up fields, because I know the late John Wheeler, and I'm sure you're familiar with him. He said his career was kind of broken into 3 parts. First particles, then fields, and then everything's information. So you've got a theory on, and if you can maybe get into a little bit more into this theory of yours, morphic resonance, because it kind of ties into this, right? So your thought process behind developing that kind of ties into this Trinitarian view in a sense?
Yes. I mean, I didn't have a Trinitarian view when I first developed morphic resonance. That sort of came later.
Okay.
I went through an atheist phase, like many scientists. Many are still in it. But I went through an atheist phase, and I came back to a more spiritual view, partly through India, living and working in India, and actually through living and working in India, came back to a Christian path. I was actually confirmed in the Church of South India. And so I found my way back to a Christian path via India. It's an unusual route, I know.
Yeah.
But morphic resonance came earlier than that, and it came because I was trying to understand inheritance of form. I was working on the development of plants at Cambridge, doing research in developmental biology. And I was trying to understand how form is inherited. And I came to the conclusion that genes were grossly overrated. People like Richard Dawkins were going around saying everything's shaped by selfish genes. I thought genes were very grossly overrated because what they do is code for the structure of proteins, the primary structure of proteins. They don't code for the shape of your face or the pattern on a bird's wings, or the color of a butterfly's wings, the patterns on the wings. So I think that I thought form had to be inherited in some other way, and instincts which are like the habits of a species, its behavior. And I came up with the idea that if there's a memory in nature, if there's a direct connection across time, then many of these surprising puzzles could be explained. Now, most people don't see them as puzzles because they think genes explain it all. But I was a biochemist. I was teaching about DNA and molecular biology to students at Cambridge. And it wasn't as if I didn't know about this. I was personally quite friendly with Francis Crick, who discovered the structure of DNA.
Oh, okay.
I was sort of in the middle of that world, and I came to the conclusion it just wasn't enough. So the idea of morphic resonance is that there's a kind of collective memory in each species, inherited directly through an influence from all the past members of the species. Each individual contributes to that collective memory and draws upon it. And so, in the most general sense, this suggests that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. They develop through a kind of natural selection, but they're not like a kind of fixed Napoleonic code, as most scientists assume, that was given at the moment of the Big Bang. The usual scientific assumption is that all the laws of nature and all the constants of nature were fixed and emerged from nothing at the moment of the Big Bang, along with all the energy and matter in the universe. And as my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws of nature from nowhere in a single instant.
I see what you did there.
One free miracle.
Wow.
I love it. And they accuse us. So I wanted to explore this just a little bit. You talk about a collective memory. That strikes me as inherently materialist. Are you saying that there is a collective memory that is stored in the material of things? Or are you referring to something spiritual?
Well, neither really. What I'm saying is that there's a collective memory which is not material. It's not stored in things. The idea that memory is stored in things, you see, treats the question of memory as if it's something in space. The question where is about something in space. Where is it stored? So then you'd have an answer like in the brain or in the genes or something like that. But memory is a relationship in time, not in space. And what I'm suggesting is a direct connection across time, a resonance across time. We're used to the idea of resonance across space, as in radio waves, as in mobile telephones, as in acoustic resonance, and so on. Nuclear magnetic resonance, as in scanning devices in medicine. All of these are resonance in space. But what I'm suggesting is a resonance in time from the past to the present based on similarity. And that there's a direct connection. Now, that's not the same as the spiritual realm, because I think that this is the way in which all memory in nature works. I think everything in nature has a kind of memory underlying it. The so-called laws of nature have a kind of memory aspect. Even crystals and molecules have a kind of memory from previous crystals and molecules. So it's not spiritual in the sense it's not conscious and beyond nature or in a realm of spiritual freedom or anything. It's part of nature, but it's not part of nature as conceived by materialists who have, on the one hand, a belief in eternal non-material laws, and on the other hand, a kind of nature with no memory in it at all, kind of amnesic matter, governed by material laws which are beyond nature. Basically, their conception of natural laws is based on a kind of Greek Platonic philosophy of rational principles outside the universe So, it's not as if materialists don't believe in anything. They believe in some supernatural laws which are present at all times and in all places, utterly immutable and totally omnipotent. In fact, they have all the properties of God as traditionally conceived. And like God, they're invisible. So it's not as if they don't believe in anything. They have their own but very, very strong belief. What I'm saying is I think that belief is misconceived. I think it comes from a Greek philosophical assumption that ultimate reality is eternal and there's nothing truly changeable within nature. Whereas I think the key feature of the whole Judeo-Christian tradition is that there's a developmental process in nature. Even although we disagree in our interpretation of the book of Genesis, it's clear that the whole universe isn't created at once. Those 6 days, whether they're days, eons, or ages, we don't need to discuss now, but it's a series of stages or processes, the creation story. It's a process, and the whole Old Testament shows a process, and the New Testament shows a process, a developmental process in time. And so the idea of evolution is, I think, a kind of generalization of the Judeo-Christian view of history as being an unfolding process in time, whereas Greek, Hindu, and Buddhist cosmologies see history as entirely cyclical, just repetitive cycles, including reincarnation. Everything just goes in cycles with a kind of eternal basis. Whereas I think this key point of the Judeo-Christian tradition is this process view. And evolution, however one interprets it, or process, is a development in time. And I think that morphic resonance is part of that because history is changed by what happens. I mean, Christians believe, and I believe as a Christian, that history and the destiny of humanity was changed through the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Amen.
And that changed things for everyone else thereafter. And I think there's a kind of memory process there. You see, it changes things.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so
Memory,
it's interesting.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, I think morphic resonance is compatible with a view of developmental change in history and where what's happened in the past influences what happens now. And it differs from the conventional assumption that it all depends on eternal mathematical laws that are not affected by anything that actually happens.
Yeah, it's interesting that you, in this discussion that you've weaved in kind of the Greek philosophy of immutability, because we could go off on a whole nother tangent on that, because we're not Calvinists here at Real Science Radio. But, maybe what would help our audience on your hypothesis is some examples of what supports it, some evidence that supports the idea of morphic resonance. And I think you've had examples of like how you can train rats to do something and then somehow rats across the globe learn the same thing without it being taught. It was taught locally, and yet globally, rats kind of learn this technique or this new thing.
Well, there was an actual experiment started at Harvard where they trained rats to escape from a water maze. They had to swim to the right exit. And it took them to start with more than 250 trials before they cottoned on and got it. Within about 25 generations, it only took them about 25 trials to learn. This rate of learning speeded up tenfold. They assumed that it was because of the inheritance of acquired characters, or what we now call epigenetic inheritance. But when this was checked out in Australia and in Scotland, they found their rats started off where the Harvard rats had left off, with about 25 errors, and they got better and better. But not only did the rats descended from trained parents get better, but all the rats of that breed were getting better. Now, that's what I'd expect with morphic resonance. If a lot of animals learn a new trick, all around the world it should be easier for others to learn it. If lots of humans learn something new, like programming computers, playing video games, surfboarding, snowboarding, it should get easier for others to learn it. And one line of evidence comes from the rather amazing fact that average intelligence in intelligence tests improved all over the world by about 30%. over the course of the 20th century, not because people were getting 30% smarter, but because the tests were getting easier to do. And I think the tests were getting easier to do because so many people had done them. And right now, I have an experimental project going on to find out whether it gets easier every day for people to do the New York Times 5-letter word puzzle, wordle. Every day there's a new puzzle. Millions of people do it. Is it getting easier to do in the evening compared with the morning? Well, we don't know yet, but there's a student looking into this here in Britain at the moment, and she's going to measure when it's first published in New Zealand, then it sweeps around the world with the day, and the last people doing it in Hawaii. So she's getting the scores from New Zealand and Hawaii, which would be right to an extended day to see what's going on. Now, this also applies to crystals. If you make a new chemical and crystallize it for the first time, it may take a long time to crystallize. But if you keep making the same chemical, it should get easier to crystallize all over the world as a new habit develops. And that seems to be what happens. Chemists find that new compounds often get easier to crystallize. So these are all examples of morphic resonance.
Okay, so I want to jump in real quick, Dr. Sheldrake. The examples you just gave, they seem to terrify materialists. I watched your debate with Michael Schumer, and at the very early stages of the debate, as soon as you mentioned anything, I can't remember the exact phrase, but you mentioned something immaterial. And Michael Schumer immediately crossed his arms, and pretty much for the rest of the debate, he sat in this defensive, cross-armed position. And I've read a number of the criticisms of your experiments online, and it seems to me that there is some measure of actual hysterical fear on the part of materialists whenever you get into mentioning things like this that cause them to attack your methods. Rather scrupulously, I must say. They do attack your methods rather scrupulously. And what do you think is the source of the fear that is obvious in their hearts and in their eyes when they're confronted with this idea that there may be things outside of the material universe that are worthy of consideration?
Well, some materialists have made materialism into their worldview. It is a kind of religion for them. It's an anti-religion. I mean, it's an atheist worldview. And if you look at the actual personal history of many materialists, there are people who themselves or whose parents or grandparents have rejected a religious worldview, usually Christian, sometimes Jewish. But Christianity is the religion that generates the largest number of atheists. Islam isn't so atheist generating as Christianity. Christianity is like a kind of engine for generating atheism.
Now there's an interesting concept that we should look into. That is profound.
Well, I think it's a very important fact, and we need to recognize it. And you see, I think what happens with materialists is that they've personally rejected Christianity or Judaism for various reasons. I mean, Oliver Sacks, the Jewish neurologist, was a militant atheist. He rejected Judaism because he was gay. And when he was a teenager, his Jewish family told him that God was against everyone who was gay, and he was utterly condemned for being gay. So he decided he was against God. And so if God was against him because he was gay, so he found a ready basis for that in materialist atheism, putting his faith in science. Some people reject Christianity because, for a variety of reasons, they've had oppressive puritanical upbringings, etc. And if they take up materialism, then it provides them with an alternative worldview that seems to explain everything, with no afterlife, so no need to be, if you've been brought up to be afraid of hell, then you don't need to be afraid of hell anymore because there's no such thing as any afterlife. if you've been brought up to feel guilty about sex, no need to feel guilty about sex. But above all, the big payoff for materialists is the feeling that if they become materialists, they're smarter than everyone else. They've seen through the dogmas of religion. They've seen through these childish beliefs that have held back humanity for centuries. They've seen through all that, and they've risen above it. And basically, their stance is they're smarter. And so materialism is very important for them because it justifies their atheism and their self-satisfaction at being smarter than everyone else. And what happens, why I get a lot of flack, is that, I'm a scientist. I've studied at Cambridge, I've studied at Harvard, I got a PhD, I published papers in peer-reviewed journals, including Nature and the Proceedings of the Royal Society. And they can't dismiss me as being someone who's just ignorant and stupid, who doesn't know these things, who hasn't studied science. So I get under their skin. And then what I'm basically doing is trying to point out in my book, The Science Delusion, called Science Set Free in the US, the 10 dogmas of materialism, which are part of their belief system, actually are not very well supported by science. They're not supported by science at all. It is a dogmatic belief system. And they're very, very resistant to that being pointed out because basically their whole sense of personal identity would collapse without it. So it does trigger off anxiety, anger, fear, because it is essentially a dogmatic belief system. They like to portray religious people as dogmatic believers and taking everything on faith and authority. But actually, nowhere is that more true in the modern world than among materialist atheists. Most of them actually don't know very much science. And when they say they put their trust in science, basically they put their trust in what the high priests of science tell them. They haven't personally gone to the Large Hadron Collider and conducted experiments, or personally sequenced DNA, or personally analyzed genes or anything. They've just taken the whole lot on faith. So I think that is the real reason they get so upset and angry, and why they're so immune to evidence. I mean, in the debate with Michael Schumer, he showed not the slightest interest in evidence for anything that went against his point of view. He just thought it must be rubbish.
Yeah. So instead, they do things like ban your talk on TED TV. I mean, I guess that really was banned. I know people can watch it. It was. We've played clips of it before.
Well, they tried banning it, but the thing is that you can't really ban anything nowadays. And when word got out they were planning to ban it, people cloned the talk and put it up all over the internet. So actually, they did me a good turn. You see, I think providence works through atheists as well as through Christians and believers. And before my talk had been banned, it had about 30,000 views. It's now had about 8 million in various formats on different websites. By far the most successful thing I've ever done in terms of exposure. Yeah. And that would not have happened without a helping hand from the militant atheists.
Well said. Well said.
It goes back to the truism that God's word never returns void. And God's word, whether the atheists want it to or not, God's word does govern everything to a certain degree. Now, you had mentioned earlier, when I asked you about spiritual versus physical, it seemed like you implied that spiritual is necessarily separate from nature. Is that your belief? Can you clarify that? Is the spiritual necessarily separate from the natural?
No, I think the spiritual underlies the whole of nature. As I was saying, I think the energy in nature is a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. So I see God as sustaining the whole universe from moment to moment, underlying all reality, not just setting up a universe in the first place, pressing a start button, and then having it all go on automatically like a machine. I think that God is sustaining all things. So in that sense, the Spirit of God pervades all nature all the time. But as we experience the spiritual, I think we experience it through our consciousness. And I think we experience our consciousness is not the same as the material activity of our body. It's obviously permeates the body and depends on it. Um, but the distinction I really make, which I think is important, is between the bodily, the psychic, and the spiritual. Because in the when St. Paul says, "The natural man knoweth not the things of the Spirit of God," the natural man in Greek is anthropos psychikos, the psychic man or the ensouled man. Um, and I think there's a realm of the psychic, which includes telepathy, premonitions, um, and what some might call the sixth sense, which is part of animal nature as well as human nature. I've done a lot of research, as you know, with psychic dogs, as in dogs that know when their owners are coming home. Um, and I think the psychic level is to do with survival abilities and skills. I think wolves know what other wolves are doing when they're miles away. It's part of the way they coordinate the social group. Dogs become part of a human family and pick up our intentions, our thoughts. I don't think these are spiritual powers. I think they're like the senses. I mean, smell, taste, touch, vision, hearing. I think they're like a kind of invisible sense, like a sixth sense, um, which, like everything in nature, has a spiritual underpinning, but is not in itself spiritual. Um, so I think I distinguish between psychic and spiritual. Now, this is one area where I run into problems with our friends, the materialists, because they don't believe in psychic phenomena. They don't think telepathy and things are possible. They don't think dogs can possibly pick up their owner's intentions and so on. And the reason they're so down on psychic phenomena is they think that if you let in any invisible influence at all, then God's going to come back through the back door. And so they feel they have to deny all these psychic phenomena. I spend a certain amount of time speaking to skeptic groups. If they invite me, I accept their invitation. I go and address them, atheist organizations. And one of my messages to them is you don't need to be afraid of telepathy and psychic powers because these are part of nature. They're natural, not supernatural, normal, not paranormal. They're just something science hasn't dealt with yet, but they're part of nature. Whereas spiritual things are somewhat more different. They're about choice. They're about the most fundamental choices we make. They're about morality. They're about our connection with the divine, our openness to God and the influence of God. And they're not quite the same as totally survival instinct level. This is something of a different level of consciousness. So I think all of them, everything is ultimately pervaded by the spirit. But I think there's a distinction between body, psyche, and spirit in our own lives, which it's important to recognize.
Okay.
Well, that's interesting. So this gives me a better picture of this morphic resonance. And isn't there evidence, for example, of like dogs who kind of react when their owners on the way home? So there is evidence. It's not just a thought and an idea. And one of the things about science is a hard currency of science is predictions. And I love that you're doing that test with that wordle. Is that the name of it? I don't play it.
Wordle, W-O-R-D-L-E, Wordle, yes.
Okay. And, I will have to say anecdotally, it's not working on my dad. He's still terrible at those games, no matter what time of day it is. But but that's wow, that's really interesting. And I know you've even talked about this, and I know this is going to be foreign to a lot of people, but even, maybe even the sun and the stars, they have a consciousness about them. And that somehow plays into this morphic resonance, that there's a third element. It's not just matter and energy, that somehow there's an interaction. And I'm curious, because I heard you talk about that. Would you believe that that's kind of tied together with electrons, with a magnetic force? Because, that's what plasma cosmology thinks, that magnetic forces are not considered enough by the secular standard cosmology.
Well, I think that somehow, in a way we don't understand yet, that electromagnetic fields are a kind of interface with consciousness. Our brains are mainly electromagnetic in the way they work, and somehow our minds interact with our brains. No one knows how. But I think that if we take the view that what interfaces with our bodies and brains is this electromagnetic activity, then the sun has vastly more complex electromagnetic activity than we do. I mean, solar flares, sunspots, 11-year cycles, all these NASA space probes and space observatories monitoring solar weather. It's changing all the time. And I think the mind of the sun could interface with these electromagnetic fields, which are basically within plasma. The sun's made of plasma. And I think the sun and the other stars may be conscious beings. I don't think that consciousness is confined to brains. And one of the things materialists believe is that the whole universe is completely unconscious, except in human and perhaps a few animal brains. The light bulb of consciousness is switched on for unknown reasons. That's the materialist worldview. And they have an awful problem explaining why anything's conscious at all. That's why it's called the hard problem, the very existence of human consciousness. But in the past, people thought consciousness was much more widespread in nature, that nature was alive. In the Middle Ages, it was taken for granted. It was taught in medieval universities that nature was alive. Animals are called animals because they have a soul. Anima is the Latin for soul, built into our language. So they didn't believe they had an immortal soul like humans, but they thought they had a soul that organized their bodies and their instincts. And so I think that the stars and nature are all a reflection of an ultimate conscious source of all things, which I think of as God. And there's no reason why consciousness should just be confined to human brains. That's why I'm exploring the idea the sun is conscious, because I think from a scientific point of view, this is an open question. It's not because it's a dogma of religious belief or anything like that. It's not part of my religious faith that it's conscious or not conscious. It's an open question. And I think it's the kind of thing scientists should look at.
Yeah, it's a fun topic to consider, It's definitely not out of the realm of possibility in God's created nature. And I love how you referred basically to Hebrews 1:3 that God upholds all things by the word of his power. So he's upholding all things now.
Yes. It's a question, I'm afraid, that is off limits for materialist scientists. It can't be looked into because, as you said earlier, it would threaten their entire worldview. You said something earlier that could be construed by Christians and Jews to be a threatening statement. You mentioned a fellow who rejected Judaism because he was taught by his family that God is against everyone who's gay, and he decided since he was gay that he was going to be against God. And I could go like this and start to get a little bit defensive, but of course, we all understand that God's not against any man. He's not against anyone. He's for everyone. God recommends against certain behaviors for obvious reasons, and God wants what's good for all of us. But I don't feel the kind of the knee-jerk need to defend every aspect of God against any question at any time, the way I saw Michael Schumer respond to your implications that there was something beyond the material. Michael Schumer said, first of all, he said, I'm not God, you're not God. And he said, there's an objective reality. I don't know what it is, and you don't either. Dr. Sheldrake, I think that's an overstatement. What do you think?
Well, I think it would be definitely true to say that no one understands the whole of reality, including the mind of God, the whole of nature, etc. We're limited humans, and obviously, by definition, our minds are human minds with a limited power of understanding. So I think that a confession of ignorance is reasonable for anyone. So I don't have a problem with that. I think the idea that there's an objective reality to which science has unique access is questionable because scientists are humans, and as some physicists have pointed out, our theories about nature are theories in human minds. And the so-called laws of nature are not out there. You don't actually run into a law of nature when you're sort of looking through a telescope. You don't see Newton's laws or Maxwell's equations. These are invisible things which are accessed only through minds. And so for scientists to understand nature, they can only do so through their minds. So to the very idea of objective nature, which relies on human minds to formulate that very idea. So I think that it's, the idea that somehow nature is totally independent of all minds and all consciousness is an illusion that materialists have created. And they themselves are the first to say they believe in science and reason itself implies mind.
Yes.
So if you're going to have mind in nature and mind in underlying nature, which makes it comprehensible, their belief that it's comprehensible through mathematical laws implies that underlying nature is something mind-like, and it can only be appreciated through minds, and they're very proud of their own minds and how smart they are. So it's actually, to think of it as objective out there with no consciousness is not what science is actually telling us.
True.
And not what Schumer could possibly believe, given that he's a devotee of science and reason.
Yes, and that's why the statement struck me as disingenuous. Now, I'm not God, you're not God. That's not an overstatement. That's true. I don't necessarily believe that Michael Schumer believes that he's not God. But I also believe it's an overstatement to say that we don't know what reality is. I think we do know what reality is, and I think that Michael Schumer's statement that he doesn't know is simply a revelation of the fact that he doesn't know God. And so, Dr. Sheldrake, I don't want to imply that I absolutely understand everything about nature, but because I do know who God is, I can say that I do know what reality is, and I know that it will all be explained to me. The things I don't understand will be explained at some point. Michael Schumer does not have that touchstone. Michael Schumer and other materialists do not have that touchstone in their mind and in their heart, and not in their even in their psyche. And so, anyway, that seems to me to be the source of some of the inherent fear that you seem to strike into their hearts.
I'm so scared.
Well, it certainly doesn't help the fact that I make no secret of the fact that I'm a Christian. I mean, that arouses tremendous prejudice in a lot of scientists just to start with. And it doesn't help that I have unorthodox theories, and it doesn't help that I think there's evidence for telepathy in dogs and people and so on. None of that helps. But it doesn't help with dogmatic scientists. But the interesting thing is that a lot of dogmatic scientists, when I'm talking to them alone in the evening and stuff, become much less dogmatic. A lot of them are frightened of not agreeing with the party line when they're at work. But when they get home, many of them have had psychic experiences, some have had spiritual experiences, some have had near-death experiences, some have dogs waiting for them when they get home from the laboratory. So the fact is that most dogmatic materialists, some are really dogmatic. I mean, Michael Shermer's made a living out of it, and Richard Dawkins, it's his whole public persona. But we recently did a survey, the Scientific and Medical Network in Britain, recently did a survey of scientific, medical and engineering professionals in Britain, France and Germany, working scientists, and asked them, we had it done by a professional public opinion survey organization, how many of them are atheists? It's about 25%. It's quite a lot compared with the normal population, but it's certainly not the majority. About 20% more describe themselves as non-religious, agnostics. 45% describe themselves as atheists or non-religious. About 45% describe themselves as religious or spiritual or spiritual but not religious, or spiritual and religious. So about 45%, about 10% didn't say or didn't know or whatever, but about equal numbers were sort of non-religious and spiritual oblique religious. And the atheists are certainly not a majority, even within Europe, where atheism is much more predominant than it is in the United States. And I know from my own experience of giving talks in scientific institutions that after the talk, one after another, people come up to me and they look both ways to make sure no one's listening. And then they say, I'm really interested in what you say. I agree with a lot of what you say. I've had these experiences myself, but I can't tell my colleagues because they're all so straight. And, after 3 or 4 have done this, I said, well, actually, you're not alone. I said, there's at least 3 or 4 other people in your institute who think like you do. They said, well, how do you know? And I said, because they've just told me, him and her and him. And I said, what I say to them is, your life would be so much more fun if you come out of the closet. Spiritually minded scientists who've had psychic or spiritual experiences are quite common, and they behave like gays did in the 1950s. They were all in the closet, I think they couldn't possibly admit it. So my slogan to them really is, come out of the closet. And you'll find that if you talk freely in your laboratory tea room or with friends after work and stuff, you'll find a lot of them who actually agree with you. So right now, people who do have these views are hiding them from their colleagues. Another metaphor for this is the Soviet Union under Brezhnev. In the last days of communism, how many people in the Soviet Union really believed in communism? I mean, there were certainly some, but the majority didn't. But they didn't become outright dissidents because then they'd be locked up in psychiatric institutes or sent to Siberia. So they pretended to go along with it. Party congresses, they dutifully clap at the right moments and stuff. I think that within the world of science, it's rather like that at the moment. I think there's this materialist orthodoxy, which is held in place by inertia and by fear, but which is not actually sincerely believed in by most scientists. And if you include among most scientists Indians and South Americans, and there are more scientists in India than there are in the United States. I lived and worked in India. I hardly ever met an atheist in India. Most of the scientists, my colleagues, were devout Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs or Jains or Christians. But certainly, if you look at most of the world outside North America and Europe, most scientists there are not paid up atheists. Even here, they're not. So I think the people like Schumer and Dawkins claim to speak in the name of science, but they're actually speaking for a minority of scientists committed to a particularly dogmatic worldview that the majority don't share.
So we've got plans to have a Dr. Jim Oshman on. Now, are you familiar with his work, Dr. Sheldrake? So and I'm looking forward to this, and Doug, you may know more about it than I do, but he's got this concept of energy and how it ties to medicine. And I know one of our producers wanted us to ask if you had any familiarity with this idea of how energy plays in with medicine, and it comes from some of the work of Dr. Jim Oshman.
I don't know about his work, so I can't comment on it. I think that there are dimensions to medicine which call them energy, call them form, call them spirit, or call them whatever you like. But I think there are dimensions to energy medicine which go beyond the mechanistic worldview, but even regular mechanistic doctors recognize that through the placebo effect. If anything, if someone comes along and says they've done this faith healing and people have got better and they've miraculously cured, they just say, oh, well, it's the placebo effect. Well, the placebo effect doesn't explain anything. It's just a name for the fact that what you believe can affect what happens. And that's why in all regular clinical trials, they have to have a placebo double-blind control, because if you tell people they're having a powerful new medicine in the form of a pill, a new wonder drug, a lot of them get better, even if it's a blank pill. Right. That's called the placebo effect. And what it shows is that belief is actually a very powerful factor in healing. And so if someone says, believe in God and he'll heal you, and they get better, and they say that's nothing but the placebo effect. Basically, it's just saying belief has healed them, and or faith has healed them. Um, and in fact, faith in medicine, most doctors recognize that faith in medicine is part of its curative power. If you tell people modern medicine can work miracles with all its wonderful drugs, and here's the latest wonder drug, a lot of its curative power, even doctors themselves will admit, is the placebo effect. And this is quantified in clinical trials conducted by drug companies.
Right.
Actually, in America, they've had a real problem because in America, the medical anthropologists have shown that in America, the placebo effect is going up. In drug trials, the placebo effect is now getting so strong in America that it's hard to prove a drug actually works because the placebo effect is so strong. And the medical anthropologists explain this by saying that America is one of the very few countries where you have direct consumer advertising on TV. In Britain and Germany and elsewhere, you don't have that. You can't just advertise prescription drugs doctors prescribe them if they think you need them. But so Americans so inundated with these claims of new wonder drugs that if they're in a clinical trial and so they may be given the new wonder drug, they so have such high expectations. The placebo effect has been running out of control in the US. So drug companies are now offshoring their clinical tests to places where people aren't so saturated with American direct-to-consumer drug advertising.
Wow, that's interesting.
Wow.
So that kind of plays in a little bit to your hypothesis, right, on morphic resonance.
Well, certainly in
a
America,
sense.
the general collective belief system, it has been influenced by this medical advertising, yes, and it's having actual measurable effects.
That's interesting. Huh. Okay.
Well, so, and here at Real Science Radio, we are advocates of the truth that belief is the ultimate healer, in that if you want to be reconciled to God for eternity, belief is necessary. Belief is essential. So, Dr. Sheldrake, I just want to bounce off you a theory, as best I can recall, posited by our founder, Bob Enyart, a few years ago, about the relationship between the spirit and the body and the world. So there's the question of what's the difference between your spirit and your soul? What is that? Well, the best explanation I've heard is that body, spirit, and soul. You wear a body, you have a spirit, you are a soul. So our body is created from the dust of the ground. God gave us our spirit, and that spark of life, that eternal spark that God gave each one of us, is our soul, which He gave to us to keep forever. But that spirit that He gave us, I have the spirit of a man. Dr. Sheldrake, you have a spirit of a man. A dog has a spirit of a dog. A cat has a spirit of a cat. Now, each one of our spirits is our own spirit, but it is basically a set of instructions for how a man will operate that has a quantum connection back to a decision in the mind of God. And you mentioned earlier that God sustains reality moment by moment. I take a slightly different view that God isn't that mundane, that He's far more intelligent than to have to constantly pay attention to everything, but that he made a set of decisions early on in the creation, and by those decisions gave spirit and life to everything, and all of those spirits and those lives are sustained by this quantum connection to those decisions that were made in the mind of God. And this is the first time I've been exposed to the idea that our behaviors, decisions, and experiences may be adding information, giving feedback to that spirit. And I find it fascinating and certainly quite possible that that is true.
Well, putting it the way you do, Doug, I mean, insofar as God makes these decisions, which then say, this is like the idea of habit, you see. When you say God makes decisions and things then continue much the same. It's maybe similar to what I'm saying with habit through morphic resonance, that there's, I mean, one metaphor would be God's like a lawgiver, gives these laws and they're all written down and stuff. But that's a very political sort of human image. I think the idea of once they're established, they continue as habits, largely unconscious. As you say, God doesn't need to keep rethinking everything all the time. And I agree with that, because I think a lot of what happens in nature is happening as a result of unconscious habits. However, and I think to establish them in the first place, they have to be established through a creative act, which ultimately is where the divine spirit comes in. So, yes, so I do see it that way. But you see, then I think that as things go along, as things change, it's a difficult question, divine omniscience. Did God know everything in advance? If he did, then how are we free? If we take the idea of freedom seriously, which I do, if things are not all predetermined, then if God knows everything, then what God knows is changing as time goes on, as new things happen. And some people say, oh, it's impossible, God's beyond time and stuff. But actually, if God's incarnated in Jesus Christ, who, as Christians believe, then he's not outside time. Jesus' life was inside time, and it was a divine life inside time. And so I think that time is part of God's being, not necessarily all of it. Part of God, I'm sure, transcends time, but part of God is within time, because otherwise God wouldn't be interested in or involved in history. And the whole Christian doctrine is that God is involved in history, in what actually happens, not remotely removed from it. So it's I think it's an interactive process, and I think we're co-creators with God.
Well, so we are certainly influencing reality in a manner that we can't take back. We are making an indelible impression on reality that there will be eternal consequences, and that fits with what you've said, and so yeah, it's very, very fascinating conversation, Dr. Sheldrake.
And really, we're not too far apart on the idea of some of the ideas you just talked about with, God coming as man, Jesus Christ, and living in time with us. So we get in trouble with a lot of our Christian friends. We don't get into, a bunch of theology because this is a science show, but it's probably fairly well known, at least from our regular listeners, that we're more in the open theist camp, which we don't believe God is outside of time, that time is simply the passing of one moment to the next.
Yes.
And that does, that's more, in my view, definitely more biblical. And we've got, a sister channel with In Your Theology that deals a lot more with this concept that maybe you'll find interesting, Dr. Sheldrake.
Yes. Yes. I like to say that we are in time. We are inside of time with God. He was already here. That's my
good way to put it. All right. Well, Dr. Sheldrake, we're getting close to out of time. I super appreciate you joining us on Real Science Radio. I find you're one of the most brilliant scientists I've ever encountered. And you just have a great way, too, of explaining things. I can just put on my headphones and listen to your talks. And a lot of it, some of it goes over my head, but a lot of it doesn't, because you just do such a great job of explaining your perspective. Such an honor. We share the common thing. We both like to play the piano. I know you're more of a concert pianist. So maybe I can get you to try a Supertramp song at some point, or maybe Journey, Don't Stop Believing.
Now wait, Dr. Sheldrake. So now I did, in researching, of course, I did happen to see the year of your birth. You look fantastic, by the way. I do want to ask, I stopped listening to popular music probably at the age of about 25. Do you fall into that same camp, that everything after about the age of 25 you pretty much lost interest in?
Well, not really. Partly because one of my sons is a composer, Cosmo, who writes the most beautiful music. He's a jazz pianist. Both my sons are jazz pianists. And so my son Cosmo Sheldrake, if you look him up, he's streaming on YouTube and things, writes the most beautiful music. It's contemporary. Well, I mean, it's more in the popular vein. A lot of it's nature-based, based on bird song, whale sounds, nature sounds. And it's uplifting, inspiring. And through Cosmo, I actually get exposed to quite a bit of contemporary music. It's not heavy rock or heavy metal, that kind of thing. But it's just beautiful music. Yeah, I get, and then because both my sons, Cosmo has a band. My son Merlin, who's a biologist, has had a band. They both play the piano. Here at Christmas, they've got musical friends on Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, which is a big party day in England. We had about 20 people in our home, many of them musicians. We had music for hours and hours and hours. I went to bed about 4 a.m., but I think that some of them were at it till about 7 or 8 in the morning. So we have plenty of music here and all kinds.
Well, in the future, we plan to have a show on, there's a paper called The Phenomenon of the Number Three in Music, speaking of the number three in nature. So, yeah, I thought that's pretty cool that, with your background and with your son, Cosmo. Now, that leads to another question, actually. Is your other son, is he kind of following your research? Is there someone carrying on this particular research that you've been involved in so long?
Well, my other son, Merlin Sheldrake, wrote a book called Entangled Life, which is about fungi and their relationship to the Wood Wide Web, these things underground that connect trees. Well, his book won the Royal Society's Science Book of the Year prize, the highest award you can have for a science book in England. He was on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks. It's a best-selling book. So now Merlin more or less shares my views, but one thing Merlin has learned from me is how to avoid pushback from the science establishment. So Merlin's managed to put across a view of related life as being interconnected, interrelated, etc., very similar to my own view of life, but he's managed to do it without provoking a backlash, and it's partly because he's seen how I have provoked a backlash, and I now run all my writings past Merlin, who removes trigger words from them, and it shows me how I can do a better job in getting the message across to other scientists. So I'm learning a lot from my own son, partly because he's learned, as he says himself, quite a lot from me. So it's a mutual process.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, ask Merlin if he'd ever be interested in coming on Real Science Radio.
What a blessing.
Well, you could ask him yourself.
Yeah, I will. I'll do that. We'll do that. Okay. Is there any other closing thoughts you'd like to share, Dr. Sheldrake?
Well, just to, in case people want to find out more about my work, if you can put a link to my website, sheldrake.org, and my YouTube channel, that would be good. And my
absolutely.
podcast channel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
we will for sure.
We will do that for sure, Dr. Sheldrake. And then I have a scripture to close with real quick. Ecclesiastes 12, starting in verse 5. Also, when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Your theory of morphic resonance, I feel like, is some insight into this spirit that God gave to everything and everyone, and just very much appreciate your coming on and sharing that insight with us, Dr. Sheldrake. God bless you, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Very good to be with you, Doug and Fred.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so for Dr. Rupert Sheldrake and my co-host Doug McBurney, I'm Fred Williams of Real Science Radio. May God bless you.